welcome to our event for the day. We're going to be talking today about the last 10 days, countdown to the 2020 vote. I don't know that the event needs much more explanation than that. We have a great group of panelists here today, and John Cohen, who's the Chief Research Officer at Surveymonkey, Chris Parker, who's a professor of political science at the University of Washington, and Kathryn Pearson, who's a professor of political science at UC Berkeley. They're going to present to us in that order today their thoughts about the countdown to the 2020 vote. And I'll give you a little more introduction before each one. Our first presenter today is going to be John Cohen. John was a grad student in our program. He was a student of Nelson Polsby's, I think, originally, and then also a student of Jack Citrin's. Jack recruited him for our event today, and we're very glad to have him. He's had a number of roles in the polling world. He's been the Vice President of Research at the Pew Research Center, the Director of Polling, and the Polling Editor at the Washington Post. He's worked for ABC News, for the Public Policy Institute of California. And so we're very glad to have him here today to bring us his expertise. And as I said, now his current role is at the survey firm Surveymonkey. So with that, I will hand it over to John.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Jack, and everyone for having me. I'm thrilled to speak with you today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'll try not to go too fast through my slides. I have a lot of material. We've been collecting lots of survey data this year. We started daily tracking actually around the coronavirus in the US, Canada, and the UK back in February, and have kind of been at it daily since then, have added politics to the mix because that's what people are interested in. And I know that's what you're interested in today. But I first want to talk about why we need polling more than ever. When I first came to Surveymonkey from the Pew Research Center nearly 7 years ago, the big argument was, why do we still need surveys in the era of big data? If we can track you on your cell phone, if we know what you're buying online, why do we need to ask you questions? And I naturally think I had a very good argument all these years for that. But what's interesting in the past year, 7 months really, since the pandemic, no one's asking that question. Everyone knows it's only through surveys that we're going to figure out when we feel comfortable having this event in person, when kids feel comfortable and teachers feel comfortable going back to schools, when people feel comfortable going back to the workplace. It's not just about comfort, but it's about what people want. And it's never been more clear that we need surveys to get us there. If you move to the next slide, Stephanie, the challenge, of course, is that surveys have been becoming increasingly difficult to conduct over time. Those of you who are in the field or even adjacent to it, and everyone's a poll watcher these days, knows that it's harder and harder to reach people, certainly the way that we've done it traditionally over time. These are data from the Pew Research Center showing how response rates have just eroded significantly over time. Polling is now harder. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see it's so hard that the provost of Georgetown University, who's the former director of the census, which is, after all, just a $20 billion survey, a very good one, says he doesn't have much hope for surveys. We are in a crisis, or it seems like we are, and we need to address it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that what he says that it's a problem now, it's horribly messy, but we can fix it. It's just harder to do it. And so we actually need the skills that many of your students are gaining today, not just in politics, but in the methodology of public opinion sampling and adjustment. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see what I mean by adjustment. There's no pure sample out there, certainly since the days of high response rates back in the 90s and even before, when they were even higher in the 70s and 80s on telephone, and before that in person. What the slide you're looking at here is when poll watchers have talked a lot about since the last election, which is how you need to adjust your sample, which is imperfect. You need to figure out why it's imperfect, what are the characteristics of that, and how to adjust it. And what this is showing that if you didn't use education to weight your surveys from 2004 to 2012, probably didn't matter that much. You know when it really mattered? In 2016. And that was because there was an abnormal divergence between the opinions up and down the education scale. So those with the most formal education, those with postgraduate degrees, like many in the audience maybe, were far more pro-Clinton than even BAs, than college grads were. And so you had to disaggregate those groups, or the polling estimates were wrong. Of course, pollsters will argue that the polls weren't that wrong in 2016, but we can debate that. But the reality is there was some error that you needed to adjust for. It's getting harder, and we need survey engineers, as Bob Groves has recommended, to fix it. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how this comes out in our data today. So I've had a long career, gone back and forth from polling world, academics, and technology. I'm committed to kind of how do we make this more understandable? And we put up a series of interactives that we'll send out a link to that you can explore yourselves. But one of them is just showing by size of group and by preference across demographics. So here's why you see quite clearly why education is so important. If you start at the top, which is the least formal education level, that's the right is how much they support Trump, and the size is the percentage of the electorate that they make up. And then postgrads are down at the bottom. So you can see if you don't adjust your surveys, let me pull back in a second and add a very crucial point, which is this is what the vote choice looks like by education. Survey response looks exactly the opposite. So those with postgraduate degrees are far more apt to respond to surveys. And those aren't just mine on Surveymonkey. Those are the ones at the Pew Research Center. Those are the ones at the most expensive media polls you see out there every day. People with more formal education are more apt to participate in surveys, just as they're more apt than those with lower education to participate in all forms of public life. So if you don't correct this in your surveys, you get things wrong. So what we've done is try to put these tools online that people can explore this so they understand the componentry of the surveys that they're looking, not just whether they like a number or not on the top line. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to kind of go back in the Wayback Machine a little bit. It's nice to go back even farther with my Berkeley colleagues. But in 2007, I was running polling at the Washington Post. And we ran high quality surveys. We didn't even do cell phones at the time. The transition to cell phones kind of happened at the end of this cycle and kind of accelerated over the next couple of years. But at this time, we were doing landline only surveys. And we had a tried and true method that had been proven over time. We believed it. We believed it so much, not only cost a lot of money, but Dan Balls, the chief Washington correspondent, chief political correspondent for the Washington Post, still to this day, and I wrote this front page piece. We were the first survey, the Washington Post ABC News poll at the time, to show a major move among Black voters from Clinton to Obama. The Clinton campaign was apoplectic. I got really nasty phone calls. I could defend it on the methodology, and I was perfectly confident and committed to it. I also wished I had more than 157 Black voter respondents in this poll. Sample size matters. It's not everything. It's not even the main thing. But if we want to explore the intersectionalities among the voting population, because after all, good polling is about understanding what's happening, not predicting what's going to happen, because we can only measure in the moment. To do that really well in our modern society, you need to have a lot of sample. And I always think back to that moment. I wish I had had more to do a deeper analysis. If you go to the next slide, I don't have the scale problem right now, right? We're doing about 10,000 registered voter interviews a day from a randomly selected pool of people who take a large number of Surveymonkey surveys every day. And they're reasonably representative in terms of geography, out of the gate on gender, race, and age. And then we can make those statistical adjustments that I referred to earlier, the weighting. And I put up in the top right, the education split as it is today. So you see postgrads are more than 2-to-1 for Biden, much narrower among college grads, about even among those with some college, and Trump is ahead among those with high school degrees. So we can look at that, kind of and see kind of how it's playing out in this election. The other thing, of course, that scale lets us do is this map. This isn't an inferred modeled map based on those national numbers. These are 51, actually, if you count DC, independent polls that we ladder up to national, but they're weighted at the state level. So we can start to look at the interplay between these voter characteristics and the issues that people care about at the state level. And of course, another lesson from 2016 is you got to have more high quality state polls. You can't rely on those national polls. We all know that difference. And I think Kathryn will get into that more later. If you go to the next slide, this is an article that came out yesterday in Axios. We have a partnership with them for this election, showing you can do the same kind of analysis by subgroup at the state level. And this is critical to understanding the moment, judging the polls, and also trying to assess what might happen in 11 days from now. If you haven't been on Twitter today, we are currently at the Scaramucci phase. There are 11 days left. That was his tenure in the White House. It'll be over tomorrow, so he gets his due today. This is a story about the future. If you look at 18 to 34-year-old voters, it's blue, 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 with only 5 exceptions. This is a problem for the GOP going forward. We can start to get into post-election analysis another time, but it's also a problem now with the important caveat, if these people vote. But this is the kind of thing you can start to do with scale. And you kind of, it's what I always wanted as an analyst, to go deeper, not just report, well, so-and-so's up by 3 points or 5 points, because that gets really stale really quickly, and you need to dive deeper. If you go to the next slide, another way to start to express these things, I now have the education on the left side, and I've arrayed a number of other characteristics across the way. I welcome any and all feedback on these. These are new tools. We're designing them on the fly to really drive home how these combinations of voter characteristics affect vote choice. What you can see here, because we've layered in gender as well as race on education, you can see that white men at the far upper right at the top, kind of go over there. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Stephanie. That is the most pro-Trump group. And then we've kind of have a tabular readout there too. This is what kind of can spur deeper analysis of an electorate. And if you go to the next slide, these are data we shared, with some clients last night, because all eyes were in Pennsylvania. This is taking that same lens and refining it down to the nearly 22,000 voters we've talked to, or kind of corresponded with over a survey in Pennsylvania in the past 28 days. So you can really start to zero in on the subgroups that are at play, those closer to the middle, and those on the other ends. If you go to the next slide, do the similar analysis, this time just with race and age in Florida. Florida, as Tim Russert said way back in 2000. I think an election night that I watched at IGS, at least the start of it, before it got much too long. But you see here, kind of how the Florida electorate starts to shape up, and kind of white voters on the Trump side. There is this arc by age. The 65 plus group is obviously the one to watch. Our data overall have Florida really teeter-tottering. Our daily update, which came out a few hours ago, has Trump +2 in Florida. A little bit of a shift from where we have been and others have been. That's going to be something to watch for reasons we'll get into in a little bit. But if you go to the next slide, this doesn't just go for, how do you do voter demographic characteristics and partisanship. There's also a new way to look at issues. So what I've done is take here the issues that people call their top concern, are rated by age, by whether they're supporting Trump or Biden. And so I just want to call your attention to the middle column on immigration, where you see, and a lot of this has to do with the demographics as well, but you can start to look at the interplay between demographics and issue preferences and policy preferences for that matter, when you have enough data. And what you see in immigration is that younger people who prioritize immigration are Biden over Trump, whereas older people, particularly seniors who prioritize immigration, are 84-14 for Trump. And again, this is that you go back to Florida and you start to reanalyze this, and you start to see some of the messaging that the Trump campaign is doing, that Michael Bloomberg, who's pouring $100 million into Florida, are focused on, and you can start to see it play out because of these numbers. If you go to the next slide. So kind of what do our numbers show today? I long avoided electoral college roll-ups. We can talk about it later, but this is where the race stands today. When you take, I won't make you count pixels here. This is pointing as of today, Biden is above 300 electoral college votes. So what happens in the next 11 days? And I should say, voting doesn't start in 11 days. Voting's been going on for months, or at least a month in many places. You'll see some stats on that in a minute. But this is kind of what it all rolls up to. And if you go to the next slide, then it's like, okay, great. Might have thought this before. What can go wrong? Well, I'll tell you some of the things I'm worried about and some things that I'm not. This is a contest, as you saw on the right, as you've seen if you've been kind of viewing any polling aggregating sites, that hasn't moved a lot. We're talking about single point changes over time. These are on the right are our national data from all the way back to June. This is a pretty steady state race. That's not what 2016 looked like. 2016, there were some big ups and downs, including massive swings in some national polls in the final weeks. What you see on the left is the results, I think, from nearly 1 million voters just in the past, well, I guess since June, about Trump approval. And if you look down those months, you can hardly see any movement on the middle area. Basically, his approval rating's been the same. This guy has a ceiling and a floor that are incredibly durable. And so that hasn't moved. People's impressions of Trump aren't moving, and they're not really moving on Biden and Trump. Therefore, it's all about turnout, as they say, and there's some real wild cards here. So I just want to go through a couple of those, and then I'll turn the mic over to my co-presenters. So go on the next slide. So how could they be wrong? That's fine, hasn't moved, understand the dynamics of it, but this time really is different. This is Michael McDonald from University of Florida, has more than 52 million Americans have already voted. This is unprecedented. This really matters. This election is not like the past one. Mainly modelers, but also pollsters think about the last time around when they're approaching something now. This is a problem when this is clearly different. We just don't know how yet. And if you go to the next slide, you'll start to see some of the data and kind of what is causing some agita among pollsters and prognosticators alike. So I just took a selection of states, many close ones, and also included, Kathryn, Minnesota for you. I apologize, I didn't put in California or Washington. We have the data, we have them for all 50, but those aren't that close, or even less close than Minnesota. But what you see here is that Biden's support among those voters who are participating by mail is sky high. It drops dramatically in most cases. All cases it drops, in most cases dramatically when it comes to in-person early votes, and then drops even more dramatically still when we think about election day voting. This really matters. This is a real reason why polls could be wrong. There's just uncertainty about how people are going to participate. And if you go to the next slide, I'll explain that in a little more detail. This takes those same states and takes the vote preferences among people who say they've already voted and those who say they're absolutely certain they will vote. And I say, in our case, online, they indicated, but this matters because what we know from voter validation studies from the CCES, which Berkeley participates in, from the Pew Research Center, where I used to work, that not everyone who said they've already voted actually votes. When you look at, when you go match them to voter rolls, not everyone who says they're absolutely certain are voting. Likewise, not everyone who says they aren't going to vote, actually, some of them do cast their ballots. So you create a probability model. And so we have probability models of, based on our past information, the probability of someone who says they're already voting, actually voting, is about 75%, give or take. Among those who say they're absolutely certain, it drops to about 70 or high 60s, depending on how you model it. What if those aren't right? Then we have a problem. There's a long way to go before Election Day. Governor Newsom in California just said that, they're not going to mandate masks at the voting booths. What happens when someone shows up and is uncomfortable with that? Are they not going to vote? There are all kinds of contingencies. And I'm not even talking about the vote counting and the lawsuits to come, but just in terms of estimating who's going to turn out and kind of the componentry of that, we don't have all the information. So we're making educated guesses, and that's the best we can do. We ground it in what we've seen before, but this time is different. And if you go to the next slide, I'll conclude by, could something else be wrong? Absolutely. But we're paid to be paranoid, and so we focus a lot on that, and we have a lot of data to dig into, and we're putting it up every day so you can dig into. And I welcome the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, John. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm sure you in the audience already have questions, and I just wanted to note that the way to ask the questions is in the Q&A portion of the Zoom. And I asked you to wait off a little bit to start putting questions in there, but you can put questions in there and we will get to them after the three presenters have talked. And so I just wanted to give you that little logistical bit. And with that, I want to move on to our next presenter, who is Chris Parker. Chris, as I already said, is a professor of political science at the University of Washington. I got to know Chris when he was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar here at Berkeley in health policy. Chris is the author of a number of books and articles. His most recent book is Change They Can Believe In, The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America. That came out with Princeton University Press in 2013. And it explores the beliefs, attitudes, and behavior of the Tea Party, which I think Chris will argue is still quite relevant for understanding our politics today, but we'll see. Chris is working on another book. It'll be his third book, called The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of American Democracy, and we can look for that in the coming year. And I suspect that what it contains will depend to some degree on the outcome of this election that Chris is going to talk about here. But as you can tell, Chris is a real expert when it comes to understanding electoral politics, and particularly the relationship of race and reactionary politics to electoral politics. So with that, I hand it over to Chris.
Thanks a lot, Rob. I can't believe it's been, over 15 years since we were hanging out at on the campus at Berkeley. You're still there, of course. I'm not. And good to see Jack and Kathryn. Haven't seen her in a long time. Nice to meet you, John. I'm really sort of honored and pleased to be among all these Berkeley PhDs. Right? I don't know how a Chicago guy got up in here, but I will try to quit ourselves really well here. So protests, the pandemic, and this is misspelled. It should be "and political engagement," but I was just at the rush trying to put this thing together. So we have this. Next slide, please. All right. So what we're trying to do right now is trying to estimate. We're trying to look at these current events in the United States. Now this and how it can affect turnout, mainly among Black folks, but I use white folks as a sort of baseline against which to track Black political mobilization later on in the presentation. So what I want to show is right now is, in general, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going in the United States at this time? And so we see in 2020, we see things start to plummet, drops off a cliff right around the early part of 2020 from 45 down to 20 percentage points. And this data was as of June 2020. Next slide, please. All right. So at the start of COVID, pessimism about the direction of the country slightly increased, but protests have amplified it. So again, this data was collected June of 2020. And so what we see is, so we look at the wrong track, right around the time the George Floyd protests start, it really starts to shoot up quite a bit. And whether or not the country's going in the right direction kind of declines right around the same time. Next slide, please. So, so we want to look at, once again, this survey was, the data was collected in June 2020. And so what we see here, like the bottom right-hand corner, we see attention paid towards the coronavirus kind of declines relative to what's happening with the protests. So at this point in time, protests are a really big deal. Although, the relationship is probably inverted right now, but at that particular point in time, at the height of the protests actually took over and outstripped the mentions of the coronavirus in the news. Next slide, please. All right, so now what we're going to examine is race relations, just as important as coronavirus, the economy, and government failure, right? So all of these issues in the United States sort of converge once again right around the height of the George Floyd protests. We see what's happening with the heavy green line at the top, the coronavirus. It sort of arcs, right around plateaus, right around April, and begins to decline May. And then in June, it completely sort of collapses. And at the same time, issues related to race at the very bottom of the chart, they're very low priority. And then they shoot up right around the same time. Once again, it's about these protests that are, at least in June, started really overtaking or competing at least with the coronavirus as far as the problems that the American public foresaw. Next slide, please. So now we want to look at where voters were in 1963 vis-a-vis right now. So in the left side of the slide, in the left panel, what we see is a question that asked in 1963, what are your feelings about this proposed mass civil rights rally to be held in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963? Of course, that's a reference to the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, when we're looking at, now this is the public writ large. So 60% of the American public were unfavorable towards that at the time versus 23%. If we look at the right side, right, the relationship is flip-flop. So 54% of the public think it's favorable, think of it as favorable, right, when it comes to Black Lives Matter versus 39% of the public who see Black Lives Matter as unfavorable. Next slide, please. Okay, so whites are more on the whole supportive of protest today than in the mid-1960s. Once again, so we're looking at on the left side of the screen, August 1966. I'd like to ask if you were in the same position as Black people, if you think it would be justified or not to march and protest in the demonstrations. 54% of white folks thought it unjustified, but if we go to the right-hand side and look at the same question, do you think that the Black Lives Matter protests across the country are justified? So we see this flip-flop effect, this inversion where 62% of white folks feel that the Black Lives Matter, at least at this time in June, were justified versus 38% who thought them unjustified. Next slide, please. All right, so voters are universally familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. So if we look at the far left side of the screen, that is the entire population writ large, with the heavy gold or yellow with those who are saying they're very familiar with it versus the balance who say they're somewhat familiar, and then the little right shaded area is the ones who say they're not at all or not familiar with it at all. So roughly 56% of the general population were familiar with very familiar with the Black Lives Matter protest. Now, if we go one panel over, if we look at Democrats, 64% of Democrats were very familiar with it. If we go one column over, 45% of pure independents, that is to say people who aren't leaners, who are pure independents. And if we go to the last column, 56% are Republicans. So pretty much what, one would think, because pure independents are, sometimes they're not as engaged, right? As they're not generally as engaged as partisans, right? So we would expect them to be a little lower on this. That Republicans, that 56% of Republicans say that they're only 56% say that they're very familiar. I was a little surprised by that, but that's par for the course. Next slide, please. Okay, but there's more intensity clearly among Black voters. So it's the same question, but when we look at whites, so 55% of whites are very familiar versus 73% of the Black community that's very familiar with Black Lives Matter versus 49% of the Latinx community. Now, I'm not quite sure what to make of that, right? 88% of the Latinx community is familiar with it, but only 49% very familiar. I'm a little puzzled by that, and I'm still kind of trying to think that one through. Next slide, please. Okay, so voters' view on Black Lives Matter has improved dramatically within the last 4 years. So if we go back to June of 2016, so there were only 39% thought the Black Lives Matter movement, or thought positively about the Black Lives Matter movement. And that shoots up to roughly 54 percentage points. So we're talking about a 15 percentage point swing in a positive direction. So let's break this down. Let's disaggregate this. Next slide. So what we see most of this action happens among young women. So if we go to the far right side of the screen on this third panel, we see this is where most of the action is taking place among young women, right? 67 versus 25%. So that's where a lot of the action is taking place, mainly young white women, because young Black women, were already favorable about it. So much of this is taking place among young white women. Next slide, please. So if we look at this chart, so if we look at, while largely favorable, Black Lives Matter is underwater among white men. So if we look at white men writ large, right, if we go over to the last column, we see a 10 percentage point deficit, 42 to 52%. If we look at white non-college men, right, we see that there's a deficit of 12 percentage points. And if we look at white college men, it's a deficit of 7 percentage points. But most of this is right around white men. So we see a huge deficit among white men overall, but more among white non-college men. Next slide, please. So if we look at the left column, just pay attention to the left column at the top in bold. 56% of respondents were supportive of the protesters, right? 56% were supportive of the protesters. Next slide, please. Okay. So a majority, including independents, believe protests are peaceful and trying to bring change. So if we look at the left side of the screen, most of the protesters are peaceful and want to bring about meaningful social reform, even though some are taking advantage and using them as an excuse to destroy property and steal things, right? So we see 46%, believe that, the protesters are somewhat responsible. If we look at the total, the protesters are not as culpable. So if we go to the next screen or next column over, it shifts quite a bit. 75% are on the side of the protesters, right? If we go to pure independence, the relationship starts shifting a bit more. 61% overall and 38% overall protester versus anti-protesters, right? And then if we go to Republicans, we see the relationship skewed even more. Next slide, please. So here's where it gets really interesting. So these are some really important events that were taking place, like right around the time this data was collected. So we see COVID-19, right? We know that has been a constant and it remains with us. We saw the anti-lockdown protest, that is to say the protesters who were completely anti-lockdown, they believe that their liberties are being infringed upon by state governments. And then we have the BLM protests. And the question is, how might each of these events affect Black political mobilization in 2020? Next slide, please. So views on COVID-19 and protests by race. So in the left-hand column that's highlighted, we see percentage of people who approve and disapprove of the way Trump is handling COVID, the way Trump is handling the protests, whether or not the recent BLM protests are justified or unjustified, and whether or not the lockdown or anti-lockdown protests are justified or unjustified. So the highlighted columns, we see the total, and then we see on the right-hand side, we see what the total is for Black, what the percentages are for Black. So whether or not Trump, whether or not the respondents approve of Trump, the way he's handling COVID, 58% of the population disapprove of the way that Trump is handling COVID. When we go to Black folks, it's 94% of Black folks disapprove of the way that Trump is handling COVID versus 51% of white and 72% of Latinx. We go if we want to go one row down or two rows down rather, whether or not you approve of the way Trump is handling the protests. 61% of the population writ large disapprove of the way Trump is handling the protests, right? But if you look at Black folks, it's 92% disapprove of the way that Trump is handling protests, right? And on the left, we see 54% of whites disapprove of the way Trump is handling the protests, and 75% of Latinx disapprove of the way Trump is handling the protests. And if we go one or two rows down, whether or not the recent BLM protests are justified, again, about 2/3 of the population believe that they were justified versus 90% of Black folks believe that they were justified. And on either side of Black folks, 62% of whites believe them to have been justified and 73% of Latinx. And the last rows, whether or not the lockdown protests were justified. Now, this is a little closer. We have 50 to 49. In this case, 50% of the population believe that the lockdown protests were justified. Only 42% of Black folks, right? And then if we shift back over to whites, 52 for white folks believe that they were justified, and 42% of Latinx believe they were justified, right? And of course, we can explain this by way of the fact that many in the Black community and Latinx community were more exposed to COVID than were white folks, right? And so therefore, when they see these anti-lockdown protests, some of the stuff that I've done elsewhere suggests that they believe that white folks don't care as much about them because they're not as affected, right? And so they believe that them protesting this is a threat to them in their lives because they don't have to wear masks, they don't want to wear masks, and they believe in Black and Latinx workers believe that this is going to lead to their demise at some point. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at how all of this impacts political engagement. First, let's look at Trump's handling of COVID-19. So let's look at the far left side. So if we look at Trump approve, whether or not you approve of Trump handling the COVID versus whether or not you approve of or disapprove of Trump handling COVID. So 85% of folks who disapprove of the way Trump handling COVID plan to vote for Biden. Let's go over to the next column that's highlighted. This number shoots up to 91% for Black folks. So 91% of Black folks who believe that Trump is not doing a good job with COVID plan to vote for Biden. Let's shift back over to the left. So that, to the white voter column. Yeah, right there. So if you're white and you disapprove of the way that Trump is handling COVID, 84% of you are going to vote for Biden. And we go all the way to the far right, to the Latinx, and that number is around 83% for the Latinx community. If you disapprove of the way Trump is handling COVID. So let's go down to the congressional vote. Let's skip the enthusiasm. Let's go to the congressional vote row here. And we see similar numbers, 85% plan to vote for Democrats if you disapprove of the way Trump is handling COVID. We go to Black folks, it shoots up again to 94%. And we go to the left for white voters, that number's around 82%. And all the way to the right for Latinx is 87%. So we see that, you know, the way that Trump is handling COVID is really structuring the way, or it looks to be structuring the way that people, or that, you know, the population is going to vote. It's really affecting vote choice in a radical way. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the protests. So if we look at the far left side of the screen panel, Trump disapprove. So it looks like if we compare this to the prior screen, this is about 5 percentage points less, right? So 80% of people who disapprove of the way Trump has handled the protest plan to vote for Biden. We skip over to the Black community, that's 90%. Now, some of you might wonder why these numbers are in red when it comes to the Black and Latinx community. That is because those cells are so small that we wanted to alert, you know, people in the audience that these numbers are like really unreliable, right? But we put them in here just in case people were curious. And so we go to the right, 76% of Latinx voters who disapprove of the way Trump is handling the protest plan to vote for Biden. And again, we go down to the last row, congressional vote. We see 79% plan to vote for Democrats who disapprove of the way Trump is handling COVID, 92% of Black folks, 76% of white voters, and 80% of Latinx voters. Next slide. Now, so if you believe that the anti-lockdown protests were unjustified, 76% of the population was planned to vote for Biden. And if we skip over to Blacks, that looks like 92%. And if we look at white voters, that drops slightly down to 73%. And if we go to the Latinx voters, that's right around 74%. So what we can see right now is that, you know, and the numbers are going to look the same, you know, as we go down row to row to row, that these protests and COVID-19 are really having an important effect on whether or not people are going to vote for Trump or Biden. Next screen, please. Okay. So in conclusion, recent events have an important impact on political engagement. The impact is noticeably greater on the Black community given the salience of race. So that's all I got. I know it seemed like I rushed through here, but my dog is back here passing gas, and this is a struggle.
Okay, Chris. That was great, and it was really interesting to see all that new data that we haven't seen before. So thanks. That was great, and I look forward to talking about it in our Q&A session some more when you've had a chance to recover from your dog there. So Kathryn Pearson is our next presenter. Kathryn is a graduate of our program here at Berkeley, and also studied with Jack while she was here. She's a professor at the University of Minnesota. She's an expert in congressional politics. She's authored numerous articles and a book entitled Party Discipline in the House of Representatives. And she's working on another book called Gendered Partisanship in the House of Representatives. It's great to have Kathryn here because she's going to talk to us about a part that we haven't paid too much attention to yet, which is what's going to happen in the House and Senate, which, as we know, if we've been following American politics, will be very important for determining the fate of whichever candidate is elected president, whether they're successful with their legislative agenda and other reforms that they are interested in making. And so with that, I hand it over to Kathryn.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Jack. It's great to be back at Berkeley and at the Citrin Center. I just wish I could be there in person rather than zooming in, as it's actually already started to snow here in Minnesota. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with public opinion experts, John Cohen and Chris Parker, throwing in some institutional politics here at the end. So as Rob said, my focus today is on US Senate races, US House races, state legislative races, and the Electoral College, and the consequences of rules for electoral politics representation and outcomes. Next slide, please. So let's first talk about the US Senate. Where are we? Currently, Republicans hold 53 U.S. Senate seats. And so to gain majority party control, Democrats would need to pick up 4 to win. If Democrats picked up 3 seats and Kamala Harris was vice president, she could break a tie, and that could have implications for Senate organization. The Senate hasn't been tied since 2000, and Democrats and Republicans got along better back then. And so they had some good and okay power sharing agreements, but they also had some senators sort of near retirement age and with health issues, so there were other incentives for those as well. I don't know how power sharing agreements would go in 2021. So there are 35 US Senate seats up in 2020, including 2 special elections, and Republicans are playing defense this time around. Democrats played defense in 2018, losing 2 seats, but 23 of the 35 seats that are up in 2020 are currently held by Republicans. And so Republicans are facing a structural disadvantage. And for many Republicans running for re-election, they're also facing the disadvantage of how President Trump is perceived in their states. So we have, you can see this figure from CQ roll call, which actually ranks every Senate race that is on the ballot. And those yellow Senate races are what they consider to be the toss-up races. So that's Montana, where Governor Steve Bullock, a Democrat, is challenging the incumbent, and being a governor who won re-election in a state where Trump does very well, Montana, that race is getting a lot of money and a lot of attention. And then Iowa, with Joni Ernst running for re-election, is also in a toss-up race. In North Carolina, Maine, Colorado, and Arizona, Republican incumbents may lose. Those seats are all leaning Democratic. And in most of those cases, the incumbents did not do a particularly effective job of distancing themselves from President Trump in states that are trending blue at the presidential level. Democrat Doug Jones is likely to lose in Alabama. And then we've got some other races where Republicans have a slight advantage, but are also competitive. So it is certainly possible that the US Senate could be in Democratic control in the next Congress, the 117th Congress. But I think it really depends on, frankly, how the president does. I mean, we think about these races as people know the Senate candidates quite well. They got a lot of attention. The competitive races raise a lot of money, and they're well known to voters. Yet increasingly, political science research shows that people vote party line. There is less ticket splitting than there has been historically when it comes to both Senate and House races. So I will turn now to the US House. Thank you. So in the House, Democrats are in a great position. In the midterms of 2018, Democrats gained 41 seats. They had needed 25 to regain majority party control, and it was considered tight. Democrats knew they would pick up seats because in midterm elections, the president's party typically loses seats, typically loses many seats, the most recent exceptions only being 1998 and 2002. And so Democrats knew they would pick up seats, but they picked up well over the 25 they needed, gaining 41 seats. And so in doing so, Democrats expanded their majority. Well, they won the majority and then expanded their reach into some less friendly territory, winning new suburban districts. And with such gains, they likely thought that they wouldn't be in a position in 2020 to expand their majority, that they'd really be focused on defending their majority. But here we are, a little over a week out, with Democrats poised to even increase their majority in the next Congress. There are a few vulnerable Democrats who represent districts that Trump won in 2016, but not very many. Most of the toss-up races are in Republican-held districts, and it is, Democrats are really, the question in the 2020 cycle for Democrats in the House is how many seats will they pick up? Next slide, please. In 2018, in addition to Democrats taking majority party control in the House, women candidates were part of the big story. In 2018, a record number of women ran for the House, and a record number won. And even as there is a gender gap in public opinion, the gender gap in candidate emergence is even bigger. So, of course, we know that within public opinion, women across subgroups tend to have a stronger preference for the Democratic candidate than men in those subgroups, but the gender gap in candidacies is even bigger. As you can see, Democrats in blue in this figure are much more likely to be running. So in 2020, women are setting records as well. There are 298 women running for the House this November. The figure on the screen, coming from the Center for American Women in Politics, actually shows all of the candidates, which include the women who ran in primaries and actually lost. So this slide, so it's larger than the actual women running in the general election, which includes 204 Democratic women and 94 Republican women. So quite a gap there. But when women run, women actually win at the same rate as men. And that's often surprising to my students because women are underrepresented. But nonetheless, when women run, women do win at the same rate, or actually in Democratic primaries these days, women actually win at higher rates than men do. So women's underrepresentation in Congress and at other levels is caused by the dearth of women candidates. One of the reasons for the gap between Democrats and Republicans is that the Democratic Party at the local level, at the state level, and including the groups that consider themselves part of the Democratic Party network, they tend to do a better job of recruiting and funding women candidates. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide really, this slide isn't of women candidates, but it's actually showing the women who currently serve in the US House. And you can see here, the gap between Democratic women in blue and Republican women in red is even bigger and increased substantially in the most recent Congress. So because of the 2018 elections, a record number of women serve in Congress now, 26 in the Senate and 102 in the House. So a record 47 women of color serve in these two chambers. And in 2018, 36 women were elected to the House and 4 women were elected to the Senate for the first time, ushering in the most diverse Congress to date, including the youngest African-American woman elected to the House, the first 2 female Muslim lawmakers, and the first 2 Native American female lawmakers. But again, it's worth noting that this graph obscures the fact that women still comprise only 24% of the House. And in 2020, both parties are poised to elect more women to the House, but the gains will still be incremental, as the slide that I showed in the figure before incorporated not only losing primary candidates, but women who are running against incumbents who face an uphill battle. Next slide, thank you. So I now want to turn to some partisan differences in the current US House of Representatives, which stand to only increase after the next election. So Republicans are in red and Democrats are in blue, and you can see that men, women, and white and non-white members are included in these sort of bubbles. And in the Republican conference in red, as these data show, there are 13 women and 187 men, and only 9 people of color, including 1 woman. Among Democrats, white men are a plurality at 91, but there are 96 people of color total among Democrats, including 55 men and 41 women, with 48 white women. And the diversity in the Democratic caucus reflects, to some extent, the diversity in the electorate. So according to David Wasserman, House Democrats represent 79% of all Asians, 72% of Latinx, 66% of African Americans, 60% of college grads, 45% of whites, 39% of Trump voters, and 20% of America's land area. So both in the electorate, as you've seen, and now in the Congress, sort of the differences between the two parties are quite stark on a number of dimensions. And that should only increase in the next Congress with the current US Senate and House races. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to briefly talk about state legislative races because state legislative races are important every year. State governments make a lot of policy, but they're particularly important in years ending with zero. And that's because it's a redistricting year that follows. It's time for the decennial census, and state legislatures have a lot to do with that in many states. So Republicans currently have a big edge in party control of state legislative chambers, and Democrats are poised to reduce that advantage, but probably not overtake Republicans. The GOP has held more state legislative chambers for a decade. But as recently as before the 2020 election, Democrats actually held a 62-36 advantage in state legislative chambers, but Democrats lost majority party control in several chambers in 2010 from a combination of, and then in the elections that followed, from a combination of strong Republican redistricting after 2010, and then bad elections for Democrats during the Obama midterms, and then strong redistricting in 2010. So in 2020, the Cook Political Report has identified 19 competitive state legislative races. And this is ominous for Republicans in that Republicans hold 14 of the 19 chambers that are poised to switch majority party control. And so again, this suggests that Democrats are well positioned to gain a half a dozen new chambers in terms of majority party control this fall, and even more if it's a very good night for Democrats. So again, why does this matter? Well, obviously, states make a lot of policy these days, especially as state government is more likely to be unified government. When we have divided government at the national level, there's been a lot of gridlock. And so with unified party control in state legislatures, whether Republican control or Democratic control, that results in a flurry of policy activity. And then, of course, state legislatures do redistricting in 35 states. In the other 15 states, whether it's a panel or judges or retired politicians, another group does redistricting. But the first crack at redrawing both state legislative lines and US congressional lines is state legislatures. And in states where there's unified party control, where one party controls both chambers of the legislature and the governor's mansion, it's likely that a partisan redistricting would result, which we've seen plenty of in every redistricting cycle. Okay, next slide. Thank you. I want to talk now about the Electoral College. Probably the politically attentive viewers on this panel are quite familiar with the Electoral College, but I think it's just worth reminding us that a US presidential election is really comprised of 50 statewide contests, and very few of them are competitive. There may be a few more competitive in 2020, but still not the majority. And state politics are closely intertwined with federal level outcomes. We think of the contest for the White House as a national election, but in practice, it consists of simultaneous state elections, where all the action is in these House races and state legislative races and Senate races. The Electoral College shapes presidential candidates' campaign strategies and election outcomes, along with citizens' opportunities to engage in the process. The founders proposed the Electoral College in an effort to mix state, congressional, and popular participation in the presidential selection process. And as stipulated in Article 2 of the Constitution, the number of electoral votes in each state equals its total number of representatives in Congress, that is, the members of the House plus the Senate. And the Constitution left it to states to choose electors who would then deliberate and choose a trusted candidate. Though originally electors voted only for the office of the president, they were able to cast 2 votes so that the person receiving the greatest number of votes would be president, and the person who got the second largest number of votes would be vice president. It's hard to imagine a scenario where Trump and Harris or Biden and Pence were together these days, but the election of 1800 prompted the passage of the 12th Amendment, which introduced a double ballot. This deliberative body of electors didn't work out as intended, and by 1824, 18 of the 24 states permitted popular voting for presidential electors, and then the other states soon followed suit. So today we're left with a constitutional framework with important consequences in presidential elections. To win, obviously, a candidate needs 270 out of 538 electoral votes. If it's a 269 tie, which if you go to some of these electoral college predicting sites, you could find many scenarios to get us there. The decision then goes to the US House of Representatives, with each state, not each member, having one vote. And in the current Congress, Republicans in the House control 26 of the 50 state delegations. And then others are evenly split or divided or controlled by Democrats. So big states, of course, are underrepresented in the Electoral College because of Senate malapportionment. But the real issue is that 48 states cast all of their electoral votes for the candidate who receives the most popular votes in the state, no matter what the margin. Only Maine and Nebraska allocate some votes based on congressional district level outcomes. And in this winner take all system, a candidate can come very close in a state and get no electoral votes. So the most striking implication is, of course, that the winner of the popular vote is not the guaranteed winner of the Electoral College and therefore the election. As we know, this happened in 2016, 2000, and 1888 and 1876. But in practice today, candidates also have incentives to spend much more time and money in swing states. And political science research has shown that some voters are better informed in swing states as they get more attention and are exposed to more information about campaigns. Next slide, please. So I like this graphic from the Cook Political Report because it shows both the number of electoral votes in these bubbles and the predictions based on polls of how likely these are to go for Biden or go for Trump in the search for 270. So you can sort of see which states to be watching first on election night. Okay, next slide. And then finally, I just want to remind us all how important electoral rules are in shaping strategies and outcomes. So in 2020, perhaps more than any other election, as we're learning in real time, states determine many important election rules. Variations in state rules mean that it is easier or possible to vote by mail in some states, but not others. Some states will have counted their absentee ballots before Election Day, and others, including critical swing states, will have not. And so election night won't really tell us that much in some very important states, as absentee ballots will only just begin to be counted. Some voters can register on Election Day, others cannot, depending on which state they live in. Some formerly incarcerated people have the right to vote, and others do not, depending on where they live. And as the two parties diverge in election rules in state legislatures with unified party control make more and more election rules, this has consequences for turnout and for outcomes, and it affects the parties differently. Democrats tend to be disadvantaged with some more strict election rules. So state politics are closely intertwined with federal level outcomes. And just like the Electoral College and in congressional elections, variation in state and district level competitiveness has implications for differences in how Americans are represented in Congress and the balance of party power. So I just want to touch on one more thing, and that is the malapportionment in the Senate. So this is my final slide. Senate malapportionment leads us to a dynamic where, since the 1980s, when Republicans have controlled the US Senate, they have rarely represented a majority of Americans, as Republicans are more likely to represent sparsely populated seats. In the House of Representatives, of course, all districts have the same number of people in them within each state and roughly across states, as long as all states have at least one representative. But Democratic districts tend to be less efficient for the parties, which is to say that in districts that Democrats tend to win, there are more Democratic voters. So some of these voters are wasted in these districts. So for example, in 2012, Democratic House candidates across the country actually got more votes than Republican House candidates did, but Republicans nonetheless maintained majority party control in the House of Representatives. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kathryn. And I again encourage the audience to put questions in the Q&A section. And so there's a chat section and a Q&A section, and the Q&A section is where we would like the questions to go. That's where we can keep track of them and make sure I can see them and put them to the panelists when I get a chance. So But I want to start out with a question of my own. I'll aim this question at John. So Kathryn and Kathryn or Chris, obviously you can comment on it too. But Kathryn noted that was talking about the Electoral College, and you talked about it some too. And I'm interested in what your sense is of the current bias in the Electoral College and what things look like in the state that you think is going to be crucial to deciding the outcome. So by bias, I mean the difference between the amount, for example, if Biden wins, that he's likely to win by nationally, and the amount he's likely to win by in the state that's crucial for getting him across to an Electoral College majority or stopping him short of that. And so I think in Kathryn's graph, that was Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. And so I'm interested in what you think of as which state is that and what's the bias look like right now?
Well, I mean, there's so many different scenarios, and Kathryn started to touch on them, and I'm dying to ask Kathryn a question too, because she described an entirely normal process, but I'm sure she's getting nagged on what an abnormal outcome might look like with dueling electorates and everything, electors. So eager for that. But I think, anticipating what election night looks like is really complicated, because if it is more like a blowout, like you're describing, we could know that pretty early. So I talked about Florida. If Florida goes for Biden, we may not, and we would know that early. First of all, Florida starts counting votes 3 weeks in advance. And with the deluge of early voters, there's a lot of those votes that will be in hand by the time polls close, late afternoon, our time on election day. If Biden has a clear win in Florida, we could know that early. And without Florida, Donald Trump's chances of winning are in the very low single digits, at the highest. So there's a scenario where you could know relatively early, relatively clearly about what's going to unfold. There still are legal challenges and there's still could be days of waiting, but it could be pretty clear. That's one scenario. There are lots of other scenarios, and that's not the way that we currently have Florida leaning. Of course, there are, as we all know, 11 days left. And if it's really close on that margin, we're waiting in Florida just as we waited in 2000, for that. I think all eyes of both campaigns are on Pennsylvania, and that was clear in the debate last night. Like that's a real, they're writing the Trump campaign is currently writing off Wisconsin and Michigan, which were key components of, his victory in 2016. They're pulling advertising down in Wisconsin. They're focusing it all on Pennsylvania. It's stitching together Pennsylvania and Florida and maintaining enough of the states he won in 16 to, have a victory. Biden, by contrast, is focusing on Arizona, on North Carolina, states that, would be just, toppings, if you will, on most of his electoral paths. And then you start to look at Texas. If Texas is really competitive, it's still 3 or 4 points in our polling for Trump. It is more narrow in others, including Quinnipiac just yesterday, I believe. Like if for somehow Biden can win Texas, this is a really early night. And many of the legal challenges that I keep alluding to may not even, come to be.
And just to follow up on that, I want to give Kathryn a chance to jump if she wants to too, since you mentioned her. And so your sense right now is like if we were focusing on Pennsylvania, it's about what are you thinking Biden is polling there now relative to Trump, and how does that compare to how he's polling nationally?
We've had him up 6 to 8 points in Pennsylvania, which happens to be exactly where he's been, nationally, basically the entire time since June.
In your polls, there's not really a big divergence.
Not from Pennsylvania to the nation. So Pennsylvania and North Carolina have been more in line with the national estimates that we've seen in our polling.
Right.
There's been more divergence elsewhere. And some of this has to do with the voters who are going to vote. I see Laura Stoker. Hi, Laura, in the Q&A asking about, it is a rare, when you look across the age brackets, you normally see more, uniform movement from older to younger voters. This time we have a lot more action among seniors for Joe Biden, and that's, kind of also true in Pennsylvania. And so that just really matters. Like what those voters are concerned about is different for seniors. When you look at Trump's base of support, it's really in those middle-age categories, and that's one of the charts I put up. But that is, Laura, to your point, new, at least as we've seen.
I'll note that Laura dropped a question in our Q&A, Laura Stoker, of what the curve for Trump losing older and younger voters is new. And is that stable? And so that, I think John talked about that. And I just wanted to repeat the question because and not everyone can see our questions, only the panelists can. So the other observers couldn't see that. And so that's what John was talking about there. But that's interesting. And it goes back to Kathryn's presentation that in your polling, you don't see a lot of evidence that we should expect, say, a popular vote victory by one of the candidates and an electoral vote victory by another. If in the crucial states, they're polling sort of similarly.
The states roll up pretty neatly into national this time. There isn't a big divergence. And the part of what is accelerating that is the number of votes, and we've seen this in other polling, for third-party candidates has fallen, dramatically. And so kind of there's less variance, across the states to the nation. No one's voting for the Supreme. Shouldn't say that. Didn't mean to offend supporters of third parties, but very few people this time, given probably the consequence of the election and the experience from 4 years ago, are supporting third-party candidates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Did you have anything to add there, Kathryn? John mentioned you.
I actually have a question for John,
Yeah.
and that is, is there a scenario, but if Trump wins re-election, isn't it going to be because he wins the Electoral College and Biden wins the popular vote?
Almost certainly.
Okay, so that is still his route to winning re-election, but you just think it's more unlikely than 2016 because of the polls.
Correct. And look, there's a big uncertainty. I don't think I've ever been more confident that the polling, I'm not just referring to the ones that I'm doing, even at great scale. So I think that they are better than they have been in a long time, including for what I mentioned, that there's more at the state level than there has been before. Most big national pollsters gave up on states. They do it in the primaries, they do it in general elections, largely because of money. They didn't this year. And I think that there's more stability there. So I've never been more confident that we are gauging voter preferences accurately, but I've never been more uncertain that voter preferences will line up with the vote tallies. And I don't mean necessarily anything nefarious, but just like there's a lot of confusion over kind of voting regulations. Nate Persley, another Berkeley grad, now Stanford law professor, gave a talk to my company earlier this week, and there are 10,000 vote calculating jurisdictions. They're all hiring new waves of workers right now. The average age of a poll worker in the country is over 65. They're hiring whole new crops all over the country of people to kind of be at these polls. They're being trained over Zoom, right? We'd all rather have this conversation in person. Can you imagine being trained for a job you've never done, and dealing with the mask situation I mentioned earlier in the next 11 days? We just don't know what election day is going to look like. And so that's when I get to asking you about what are the disaster scenarios. Not that I'm trying to freak myself out or anyone else. I have plenty to not sleep about, but we're just so much we don't know. But I'm confident we know what if everyone who wants to cast a ballot is able to cast a ballot. It seems clear, what would happen, minus give or take, certain states.
I have a question on that. I also have a question for Chris I want to move on to before we start talking about the audience questions. But so in terms of knowing on election night, you gave us, John, this idea of knowing by seeing what happens in Florida. And I'm just interested in how and whether you might or might not know about this. So it's a little bit of an unfair question. How is it that we're going to gauge that this year? It seems much more difficult in terms of the media because the exit poll problem seems larger as we have more of these people who are not actually going to the polls on election day. And when we have such a big divergence between the preferences of those voting via absentee ballot or on election day, and just is the media going to be even trying to rely on exit polls? Do you have a sense of that? And how? Anyway, I just think it's a different problem than in the past.
Well, it absolutely is. And just to disaggregate media for a second, there are media organizations that have independent professional election units.
Yeah.
That sometimes include their polling operations and sometimes don't. And then there's the media who kind of is downstream of some of the rumors that come out of those organizations or kind of other things that they're hearing. And so if you take the core set of, kind of major media organizations, the major TV networks, the AP, they have independent groups that I believe will be more reticent than ever to make calls. So that there's always the tension on election night, who wants to be the first to call something, versus who wants to be right. I think the overwhelming balance will be on you want to be right. And that goes for, Fox News, that goes for the AP, that goes for the others. So I think that they will do a good job. They've never primarily relied on exit polls in their prediction models. They mostly look at the raw vote counts. Now, again, those aren't without challenges. There are multiple, feeds of that now. But we have them. If Florida is able to count most of their votes by the time it's 9 o'clock Eastern on election night, all of this is, kind of a moot point, and we can move on. But there are all these scenarios, that kind of voting irregularities. It's almost certain there's going to be something that happens on election day that kind of really, there's some video of someone not being able to vote. It's going to happen multiple. It's going to happen on both sides. How the media reacts to those things, how the media might, portray other things. I'm not worried about the election units. The scenario that I've been talking to people about is, regardless of what the networks might say or whatever reticence they might feel, an extra, precautions from 2016 or 2000 for that matter, is what happens if Donald Trump declares victory?
Yeah.
How do you cover that moment? Because you might not know. And what that does is will be worth staying up for.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we encounter. So Chris, one question I had for you, and I think is I'm interested in what you know from your polling, and also just what you think about it generally. Is I've seen the claim made that Biden is underperforming among minority voters relative to Clinton, for example, and particularly among minority men. You were on another call I was on, another presentation I watched talking the other day, and this is a claim that Theta Scotch poll made, but I've seen it made also by a number of polling firms and so forth. And what's your sense of that, and what the explanation might be this time around? And I particularly saw something in your data that might make you either think it's true or doubt it, which is among people who in your data who didn't approve of the protests, who approved of the protests against the shutdowns, right? Most of them were voting for Trump in every group,
yeah,
but African Americans. And the African Americans who said they approved of those protests against the shutdowns, that subset, it's a small one, I imagine, but they were actually still supporting Biden on that. And so this would maybe cast some doubt on the fact that they're a weak point for Biden, but I'm interested in your thoughts about this and just the issue going forward of African American and Latino voters in the Democratic Party.
Well, thank you, Rob. I can't really speak on the Latinx community, but I can say that, yeah, there's a gender gap, right, when it comes to support for the Democrat Party just writ large, and some other like experimental work that I've done, that Black women, relative to Black men, are much more politically engaged and much more likely to turn out and vote for the Democrat candidate, which it wasn't Biden, but at the time I was doing this experimental stuff. But whoever the Democrats put up, and to turn out just at much higher rates than Black men were. So I feel more comfortable speaking about Black men, if you guys don't mind. And as a matter of fact, I think there was about 10%, I think it was close to 10% of Black men voted for Trump in 2016, which kind of shocked me until I started thinking about it a little more. And I'm like, yeah, there's some Black men who are misogynists, who were sexist, right, and who kind of like his swag, and frankly, there are some Black men who don't like. Who are, I know it's gonna sound crazy, but who can be sort of self-hating racist too, right? And so that piece didn't really surprise me, much at all. Now, relative to Hillary Clinton, Biden sort of falling off a little bit. I think that. So both Biden and Clinton, are sort of haunted by this whole super predator thing in the 1994 crime bill. But Clinton more so than Biden. And I don't think that so in the experimental work that I've done, if Trump is framed, as an existential threat to the race, there's still a gender gap there. But Black men are still more, they're going to be statistically significant as well to turn out and to vote for whoever the Democrats put up than not. But there is going to be still a gender gap is going to be maintained. Now, but they have to see Trump as an existential threat. It can't be like a threat to the economy. It can't be like a threat to Black people's jobs. It has to be like he is doing serious harm to our community writ large, right? And that beats any other alternative frame that we use. That is to say, a class-based frame. That's even to say a frame when it comes to Trump as an existential threat to democracy. The frame had to be really specific to race, right? And when Black people see him like that, even though there's a gender gap, right, that still puts the community over the finish line. And so whether or not relative to Clinton, there's a roll-off, I don't really see it, and I didn't really get a chance to comment on that, when Theta said it. But I think the Black community, because we've learned our lesson from the last election cycle. Because think about it like this: older Black folks remember the super predator remark from when Hillary Clinton said it back in the day, right? Younger Black folks remember the all lives matter remark too, right? And so I think that went a long way to softening Black support for Hillary Clinton, even though, she had a good deal of it. I don't think the same thing is going to happen with Biden this time around, because we know what we got when we didn't turn out in the numbers in which we should have turned out last time.
So I'm interested in, John, Laura asked a similar question in the chat, and I think you had indicated you would maybe had an answer to it also from your data. What you have this rich data, and
I was just poking around it. I was going to share. Professor Parker hit on it a little bit with the difference between Black men and Black women, right? There is a divergence there. There was in 2016, and there has been historically, and there certainly is now. And that comes across in some of the charts I was doing. I was actually just going to give you all a sneak peek. I ran some post-debate questions that won't be published until tomorrow morning, but kind of wanted to know, there was actually more of a policy discussion last night across a range of issues. And so one of the questions we asked was, kind of, whom do you trust to do a better job handling issues of special concern to Black Americans, right? And we think we know the answer to that, but it's not as uniform as you might imagine, including among Black Americans. So I'll just tell you, as long as you just keep it here for the moment, you guys don't go on Twitter, but among Black respondents in our poll. So first of all, 22% of Black respondents said neither, right? So kind of nearly a quarter of Black that we talked to between last night and about an hour ago said neither one will do a better job on these issues. And I'm sure that's also true about Black men versus Black women. 57% said Joe Biden, 13% said Donald Trump, 6 both. So it is overwhelming for Biden. It's bigger than any of the other issues that we asked about, certainly among Black voters, but it's not uniform. And that's something to call out. But I do think Professor Parker's point about kind of the existential threat that there may be is also relevant, because, at the end of the day, most analyses of 2016, were about turnout and also about Black turnout in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And that's why Obama was in Philadelphia just 2 days ago, why he'll be back there. Kind of the turnout is a big issue. But from a voter preference standpoint, I don't think Biden's trailing Clinton, at least not as far as I've seen it.
Okay, so that's that's interesting. I want to turn to another topic that I think maybe Kathryn, interested in what you think about this, and again, maybe the others can chip in too, which is, what about the Supreme Court nomination and its role in the Senate elections? I think you'd talked some about the Senate elections, Kathryn. I think the Republicans had hoped that would help them in some states like Iowa, for example. I don't know, what's your sense of how that's playing out?
Right. Well, the Senate elections that are competitive because the voters in those states are sort of deeply divided, and there's sort of narrow margins between them. And so to some extent, the Senate nomination, I think, both inspires strong Democrats and strong Republicans. And so I think Republicans were clearly very excited from a policy standpoint, from longevity on the Supreme Court, from a reshaping the Supreme Court perspective, to nominate and confirm Judge Amy Coney Barrett. But I think from an electoral perspective, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag because it really highlights some positions of the Republican Party that independent voters don't necessarily agree with. It certainly makes things complicated for Susan Collins, but they were already complicated for Susan Collins. So, now Republicans are probably frustrated with her, but Democrats are frustrated with her anyway. And so I think she's just going to lose. But, for Ernst, her policies are more in line with conservative Republicans, but this also reminds independent voters of that. So I think from conservative Republicans' perspective, for a generation of a Supreme Court, it's sort of a policy win, but I don't think it's an electoral win necessarily, because it does inspire Republican voters, but in a presidential election, they were turning out anyway.
Yeah. I'm interested. I suspect John has some polling maybe on this too, but I want to move to an audience. I think that's an interesting take on. And I want to move to an audience question, which I think is probably best aimed at John, although again, all of you are welcome to comment, which is how are prospective voters viewing the economic consequences of the pandemic? Does Trump get credit for what was happening prior to the pandemic under his presidency, or are people blaming him for what's happening now? And I don't know if.
Yeah, in some ways he does get credit. Like if you look across issues, and there's been data produced lots of places this week about this, he actually kind of has either a tie or just very close to Biden when it comes to the economy, whereas he trails him by double digits when it comes to handling the coronavirus and a range of other issues. So the economy, is his best issue. If you look at the chart that I put up earlier by issue, if you look at voters who prioritize or call jobs in the economy the number one issue facing the country today, they're overwhelmingly for Trump. So he does get some credit for it. But the problem is there are all these other issues to consider, and people are focused on the coronavirus. Among healthcare voters, for instance, he loses by more than at least 3-1. So there is that ratio there, but he does get some credit for it. Well, interestingly, I think the NBC Wall Street Journal poll earlier this week has this: are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And more people say yes than no, right? But is the country better off? More people say no than yes. So you have this kind of difference, kind of in terms of where the focus is. And there is this, kind of seeming emerging judgment that Biden is better for the country, even if Trump is better for individual people. But that's a tension that we're seeing playing out, and it depends on where it plays out and how it plays out. And that's why Biden's, call to kind of the kitchen table last night, which Trump dismissed, might actually be meaningful, because it does actually matter what is happening in people's lives and what they see. And that's not usually the stock market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It'll be interesting. It's interesting to see how that's playing out. I found that the thing that you cited about the are you better off?
It's amazing.
Fascinating. I didn't really anticipate that until I saw that, and then it made some sense once I saw it. But the divergence between their individual sense of that and their sense of how the country is doing. So.
Could I call out another Q&A that I'm curious about what everyone else thinks too, but it's from Avi Rosenzweig about the role of high negatives versus high positives.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about the Senate level too, just because, everyone is the emotions are running really high around this election. And I see those positives and negatives as crucial. When I think back, the major uncertainty we faced in 2016 is how do voters confront two unpopular candidates? And how do they relate to that? And what's interesting, and one reason I'm more confident now, is that we have one still, kind of one candidate with strong negatives, Trump, and one who's viewed equally negatively and positively, and that's Biden. And so it's a much different scenario. But I see that dynamic. Just, do you like these people, as playing out as people decide whether it's worth to wait in line, whether it's worth to not wear a mask, to wear a mask, et cetera. But I'm curious about what everyone else thinks too.
Well, I can speak to it, from well, to the extent that we can think of threat as dislike, and of course we can, sort of negative affect, that I mean, yeah, I think it's a matter of choosing. I mean, clearly, I mean, it's pretty obvious the lesser of two evils. I mean, I don't think anybody. I mean, very. People are clearly voting more for against Trump if they're voting for Biden than for Biden. That's the sense that I get. I don't know about you, John, perhaps Kathryn, maybe you have some information on this, but that's certainly the impression I get from examining some of the open-ended responses from the Black community. They're not too crazy about Biden, but they hate Trump, right? They hate him. And that's, once again, it's this whole idea of this existential threat. Like before it was like, okay, well, and I said this many years ago, like in 2016, I'm like, look, Black people are going to be like, okay, yeah, we're not too crazy about Hillary, like older and younger Black folks, right? I mean, of course, this is belied by the fact that Biden, like think about what happened with Biden in South Carolina. The Black community, saved his candidacy, right? Boom, in one fell swoop, because they saw what kind of person. You guys that know me know I'm doing my best to keep this clean, right? They saw who this guy was, right? Before there was no real sense of who this guy was. In 2016, they were like, look, I ain't crazy about Hillary. This idiot's not going to win. So why turn out, right? Not making that mistake again, right? Not taking any of those chances again. And so I think high negatives, at least as it pertains to Trump, in the way this sort of is related to negative affect, that is to say, anxiety and anger, is going to drive a good amount of the Black vote. So I think in that sense, it's going to, I mean, you see these lines with Black folks that are like standing in lines around the corner, wrapped around the corner and down the street, right? And we're really susceptible to COVID, right? But we're still turning out.
All voters, and Black voters in particular, we all had plausible deniability about what a Trump president is.
Yes.
Nobody has that now.
That's right.
I mean, it seems like another. Well, Kathryn, do you have a thought on the positive and negative thing? Particularly,
I was just going to add quickly that a re-election race is going to be a referendum on the incumbent. But one thing that Biden certainly has tried to do, and his campaign has tried to do, and seems to be sort of working at the edges, is really show how empathetic he is. And that was sort of a convention strategy with Braden, who stutters, and people sort of revealing all the notes he's written, commiserating with dying relatives, and that doesn't win elections, and that only helps the margins. But I do wonder if he's genuinely seen as an empathetic person because of his own life experiences, and if that strategy is working. I can ask the polling experts.
I mean, I think the other thing you could say, which is related to that, is it does seem like maybe the fact that he is not personally unpopular coming in is making it much harder for these attacks to stick about his family, and that doesn't seem to be performing in the same way, at least to this point, although that's being tested now because it's being stressed more by.
That's right. Also in data we'll have coming out tomorrow, the amount that Trump has been able to move Biden's favorability, 0.
Yeah.
0. Not that voters were susceptible to it, but like he hasn't moved it at all. Like you can't win a campaign that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I notice now that we are at 4:30, which is our allotted time to finish here. So I wanted to thank our panelists for a very interesting conversation and presentations. I wanted to thank Jack Citrin and the Citrin Center for hosting this event. We're all connected to Jack in various ways and grateful for everything he's done for us and for the campus and department. And I wanted also to thank Eva Sato and Stephanie Ping for helping organize this and make sure it ran smoothly. So a round of applause for everyone. And thanks for joining in today. We really appreciate having you all.
And thank you you didn't have to use your mute button on us.
Good night, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.